reflexes of a Swiss clock.
So let's go on and get on with it, shall we? It's my pleasure, of course, to be here with Lin Rhea, who is a former colleague of mine here at HAM, and truly one of my favorite people, even though we're not related. Lin is here to talk to me today and with you all about making ethical replicas of James Black knives. And so we only have 45 minutes, or I guess around 40, 45 until Scarlett comes in and kicks us out. And so we're going to just get right in there. You can see here in this picture, Lin is holding an enormous knife.
Yes, this knife is a replica of Bowie #1. And as with any replica, it's not usually exact, it's pretty close. But I was fortunate enough to have access to Bowie #1, the actual Bowie #1, that's housed here in the museum. So over a period of time, when I had opportunity when it was out of the case to measure it and trace it and things like that. Of course, this is all done very, very carefully with utmost respect. So that's my copy of Bowie #1, just at least the first one. And so what I'm going to do is use these photos as prompts. And so close to the edge that if I move another inch or two, I can have that light in my eye. So I'm good. There you go.
I'm sorry about my body. There's only so much that one can do. But Lin, yeah.
Okay, you go right ahead.
Okay. Lin and I are going to have kind of a little conversation, so one of the first questions that I had for Lin whenever we were talking about this is, what can a person learn by making a replica of a James Black knife, and specifically, how does creating a replica help you understand the mind of the original maker? So why does one do this, and how does it help you get into that mindset that James Black might have had?
After a period of time, and you work enough on these knives, you see enough of them that are so similar, you start to see that he had certain guidelines that he used in the construction and his process. Working on James Black's construction techniques and his style and his knives helped me to appreciate that he created not just a knife, but he created a process by which to assemble a knife. Now, if you'll notice that image by Carrie has 3 knives in it. Now, I took that photo laying on a moving blanket there in the back in the collections, and I didn't know at the time I took the picture how important that photo would be as a teaching aid. But the middle knife is the carrying knife, which has the provenance that we talked about, that Mark talked about earlier. So it's pivotal in all the body of work that James Black did. It's pivotal. So we know it's got provenance. We can study it and look at it, and we can use it as a basis or a baseline for all the other knives. But you look at the one on the left, it's so similar that you can tell that if it's not a twin, it's a closely related sibling. And the one on the right, it's a little bit stockier, a little bit wider, but the same principles of construction were used. Different dimensions, yes, but the principles of construction were used, the same ones. Now, what are the things that I learned about Black? Well, if you put a mathematical equation on a lot of his sizes and his distance between pins, the angle between, when you scribe a line from pin to pin to pin to pin, it makes kind of a zigzag. Those are very predictable. very predictable. And it's not just because they all happen to fit in a similar sized place that's similarly shaped. Yeah, that's part of it. But he created a process where in the blacksmithing trade early on, before precision technology, they had what's called emergent technology. There's Tim, you keep me straight, Tim. I got Tim and Peter and Jimmy out here watching me close, so they're our regulars in the blacksmith shop, and John. So when Black made the blade and put that, he established where his handle goes, he would work his way back toward the back, and he had his process, and this is going to be kind of hard to follow maybe, but all the loose ends are in the back end. All the loose ends are in the back, and that pommel wrap covers it. All the loose ends, all the places that you just can't hide anything, that covers it. So it's a full tang knife. That's pretty key to the whole thing. Yes, that's pretty good mistake. So he forged his blade, and he established two parallels. The one that's right here, and the one that's right there. So we actually were able to, just yesterday, take one of James Black's knives and put parallel on those two, and it was perfect. So those were two known lines that he could start with. The distance might have been different due to different size knives. But those, first of all, those were parallel. Once he had those figured out, he could divide up the pin locations and things like that. Okay. So he used that silver that's wrapped around the spine and the bottom of the knife to create a soft bed, a three-sided soft bed of silver. Silver's pretty soft. Compared to steel, the steel tank, he created a soft bed that he could easily level with a draw file. He could draw file that flat, and that gave his handle scales a place to sit flat. So whereas today we have modern equipment, we might surface grind, or make mill something flat, and we'll go right straight to the steel tank. He didn't have all that modern equipment. He had to create a soft bed in order to draw file it using the old tools. So that was part of his process. He established a place for flat scales to sit without cracks and gaps and things like that. So what he was doing was trying to make it as waterproof as possible and look good. So I'm talking to you as if I know the guy. And that's kind of my point.
Yeah.
Because working on his knives, following his construction process, I get to know him by doing that. That's the only way you can. We talked about it before in the blacksmith shop. Jimmy will testify. Jimmy's probably made John has made as many of these type knives as anyone in the state of Arkansas. And I have made a few, but these are the things we learn. And so I'm sure they agree.
And you feel like you can only learn those things by making.
Sure, that's right.
You can't learn it by looking, you can't learn it by measurement. And I mean, maybe the measuring and all of the data that you started accumulating when you were comparing these, knives that have been attributed to Black, that's what drove the curiosity, right? Of like, oh, these are, like you said, not twins, but they're like their siblings or cousins. And is that how you kind of came to this place of like, you know what, we've got all this data, but we can't really move any further into understanding it until we start trying to figure out how he did these things.
And the way we do that is by making them. Mm-hmm. And we eliminate things that in we assume that we know what he did. We know how he done it. We assume it because we're just using his appearance, the way it looks. But only by making it and running into the same problems, the same convergence of geometry that he had to deal with. Us doing that is the only way that we could learn what his issues would be with this, developing this process. So he knew after the first one or two of them, hey, this is just an accident that I have this problem every single time I make one of these. I have a problem right in this spot. Right in this spot. So he either done one of two things. He changed his process, or he figured out a graceful way to deal with that process.
You know, whenever you mentioned I think it was the last time we talking about discovering his process and how it was that he had a particular process that he followed pretty much every single time with some variations to produce these knives. And you know, as a non-knife maker, I had not considered that, but it makes sense that if you, I mean, in your X-ray series, for instance, every single X-ray you've made, I assume you have refined your process, but you have a process nonetheless. And it makes sense that anyone who is making a number of knives, you know, of their own series, of course you have a process. Of course that's something that happens as a natural result of making a number of similar things.
You'd probably be surprised to know just how little I did know about the process, or how little I considered it until I was making the X-ray, and also this project right here. I realized he had a process, and it's just up to me to discover it. And some of the finer things about this process are not apparent at all. Not apparent at all. But there's a reason why. I'm really convinced that there's a reason why that silver wrap on the Picasso was used. I'm convinced I know what it is. I've never heard anyone say what it is, but the geometry of the blade and the geometry of the handle, when they come together, it creates not a square ridge, it creates a diagonal ridge that's going to stand out like a sore thumb on a blade. If you, in front of the handle, that's the front of the handle. That's where the Picasso cover, the silver, starts. And in that space right there, there's a crest, just like a peak on a roof. And it's not square, it's angled, covers more of the blade, but it's just natural geometry from the blade to the handle. And so how do you deal with that? Do you just roll it over and fake it? Well, he may have done that on some of them, because we've seen some of his knives that don't have that silver Picasso cover. But a good way to do it was to put a wrap there and create the front part of those three planks, those three surfaces that the handle, he could create a flat. It would stop up that gap right here, that trench. That's the tang, this is the silver, and it may only be a few thousand thick. Same here, a few thousand thick, but this right here, the same thickness, would stop that up. And give a good place for this flat scale to set on there. Now, if that's this so thick, that's the same thickness, and you got that flat, what happens back here? That means the back of your scale is sitting there quivering because it has nothing to support it.
Would you say, you know, what you've just been discussing with the Ricasso wrap, I've heard you use a term called an artifact of the process. Do you think that's like a good example of something that, I mean, it's not exactly what you were talking about when you were talking to me about the quote sharpening notch, but you know, this thing that you were saying that like nobody else has ever been like, yeah, that's what that's for, and you have this theory that essentially the process revealed itself in this way that gave you, was it through making this, essentially the process of making this that revealed itself to you in the, you know, in like, that's probably why.
Yeah, that's the only way I would ever know it, is by making it. And so, and I say I know it, I'm certain of it. But that sounds awful arrogant for me to say I'm certain of it, because I never talked to the man. But we, you know, hey, I just have gotten to know the man that deeply by doing his work.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a pretty interesting way of looking at it, yeah.
So you all have, you know, been engaged in this project of making replicas. And so how does the smith intentionally create something that is exact or near exact? I mean, down to, you know, as you fine tune understanding the process and the materials and all of that, how do you create a replica that can't be used in the future to deceive or defraud someone? You know, how do you prevent the future of counterfeit or forgery? You know, what are the ethics of making these things?
Very good question. Because these knives, original knives, can hold great value. We, as a group, a research group, we feel responsible for the information that we gather, that we learn. And while we want to, there's basically two reasons to gather this information. Maybe more reasons than two. But one of them is to just know how Black made the knives, just his process, and we discern his process. And that's what we're doing, we're discerning it. We study it, but we're discerning what his thoughts were when he was making them, what problems he had, because we're running into the same problems. So we can just kind of work backwards and say, oh, that's why he did that. But the other reason is so that we can be responsible for that information and encourage others to make these knives and feel comfortable making these knives by using those drawings like that we just had up there. But at the same time, impart to them the importance of also being responsible and thinking farther down the road than just our lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, John, this is John's knife. John made this knife, and it's so close to James Black's work. And I want you to notice something. Right now, that knife has no indication of who made it.
Yeah, my body is blocking the caption here, but it says an early unmarked Kerrigan replica made by John Miller.
But John and Peter and Tim and Jimmy, we've talked about this many times. James is back there. It's our responsibility to put our name on it. So by now that knife's got a name on it. And we're going to see another knife in a minute that John made. This one, it's another replica. This is not the same knife, it's the same type knife. I believe this one may be one of the other James Black styles, but it's the way it's photographed.
Ignore the Kerrigan style.
It may be, but you see right there, it's clearly marked. J.E.M. John Miller. So we have talked about it, and we've recognized the importance so much that when you go down in the knife gallery right now, and you look at John's that's in that middle display, he's got etching. The full plate is beautifully etched. He's got engraving all across here. He's got engraving, and on both sides, different kinds of engraving, and he's got his name on it and sunburst. And
he's made it fully his own.
Fully his own. So he took it to heart, probably a little too much. No, it's not just a replica. It's John's knife.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, back to, the ethics of this thing. When we were talking about this on the phone, I was thinking, of course, like, all of these nefarious people out there who are going to make Black replicas because they want to sell them for big bucks. And and you made this such a great point, and I was like, you kind of touched on this, like beyond your lifetime. Like, okay, so what happens if John Miller makes this super cool James Black replica knife, and like, you know, within his lifetime, he is not nefarious, and he doesn't, you know, go out and try to sell it for something that it's not. But if it's unmarked, then what happens when John's no longer here, or if he sells it to someone?
So one of the big dangers is if people say, buy one of John or mine or Jimmy's or somebody's making these replicas, what they buy it, and then they pass away, and the family doesn't care about it, and it goes to an estate sale and becomes sold, and it's in other people's hands. Well, that's when the danger increases, that it might fall into someone's hands who's not honest, and they feel like, sometimes it's just ignorance, they just don't know.
Right.
They see it and they think, well, that may be a James Black knife. I think my brother-in-law or somebody told me that looks like a James Black knife. Well, we actually had that happen here at the museum. Someone bring in a knife that it's obvious it was made to replicate one of James Black's knives, but they wanted it authenticated so they could prove more or less that it was James Black made knife. Well, what we decided to do was to take the knife, accept the challenge, you know, take the knife, have it x-rayed, and look at it, study it, look at the tool markings, and just think about how it's put together, compare it to something we know James Black made, and just see if we could determine if it was authentic or not. It just so happened that one had so many things going on that weren't right that we knew that it wasn't authentic. And it just, but we had to look at things like that. Those are just as important to see as the authentic ones.
Yeah.
So for our sake, and for the sake of the industry or the craft, it's just as important to see the ones that are not authentic as it is the authentic.
And so say you don't, say you want to make an identical blade, and say you know, like go back to slide 4. So say you guys now by looking at authentic or authenticated James Black knives, and you know quite a lot about the construction, and the more you make these knives, the more you know about the construction. And say you don't want, you know, your initials on the blade, what are some other ways that you can ensure that this can never be passed off as an authentic blade?
Well, there's a lot of things. Of course, it could be, you know, James Black, he didn't mark his work either.
Right.
So we go back to that. We can use that as an example. He never put James Black. But so how do we identify his work? We identify it by the characteristics and the common features from knife to knife. And so when we want to make a faithful copy that looks good, looks like James Black, even distress it, make it look old and antique. So we would be sure and make it to where there's some identifying feature. If you don't want it on the outside, we put it on the inside. So if it ever was x-rayed, you'd see, and by the way, unless your initials are JB, then you're okay. You can put your initials on the tag. You might want to change your name if you start making these knives, because you're going to be scrutinized pretty closely. But you can put it to where an x-ray would show. You know, just a hollow place with, for instance, mine would be an L, an R, or some variation, some identifying mark, reproduction and a date. A date would be a good thing. Something like that. Just some way that, and we're currently developing and talking over things. I keep looking at some of support like Mark and different ones. We're constantly talking about different ways of coming up with these identifying marks. How can we do that? It's a good question. So we're kind of in the developmental stages of that. Tim?
Yeah, I just might mention that the knife that Bill Hicks made for me, his stamp broke before he got it finished. So what he did, he reversed the patterns of the rivets. So they're absolutely reversed. So there's no doubt about it. So whenever anybody finds it at the bottom of White River, they won't be able to clean it.
A discriminating knife maker or scholar would know immediately.
Yeah, so really that's important. Peter, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I think.
I'm going to be real sensitive. It's like an auction. These guys know what they're talking about.
Yeah. Would you like to take a minute to identify the guys in the audience who you've been working with?
John Miller, raise your hand. Stand up. John is one of the most experienced and best at making reproductions of James Black's work that we have in the state of Arkansas. Really good. And Tim here is with the Arkansas Reenactors with Blacksmith Shop.
Nice to look at after this is all over if you want to see some reproductions.
So, but he dressed the part.
He was at Ford's this morning. Don't give him too hard time.
Yeah. And of course, Casey spoke up. He's an apprentice in a blacksmith shop, and he's making some fine stuff too, of all different sorts. Peter Lee, one of the members that we couldn't do without. We really.
All right, I'd like a minute to say, I can't believe how much progress has been made here at Ham and in the blacksmith shop. Because what we used to talk about before that picture was made is how did they turn this corner? How did they make that edge? And with Lin's guidance, we're now talking about what was he thinking? Why did they do this whole package? You really, really move this along. There's lots of again, like so, and
What he said, that's it.
And Jimmy Worden is one of the. He's not going to say a whole lot, but when he comes to the blacksmith shop, we always want to know. We always want to know what he just made, because he's going to make something. He's going to come to the shop. He's going to show us. It's show and tell. He's the man. Show and tell.
His work speaks for him.
Yeah. Yeah.
So going back, is it anybody else you'd like to know?
Yeah, Mark Zaleski. Of course, you
there he
know
is.
Mark, but Mark and somebody that came today that got to kind of help make this all happen when it all began. David X.
Oh, yeah.
David.
Yeah.
He made it possible for us to ever get started on all this, so I appreciate that, David. He greased all the skids and contacted folks. His idea to get these knives, get this research project kicked off was, we commiserated a lot, but David made it possible. Just want to mention that.
It's a team effort.
Yeah, it has been. This has all been development.
And we look forward to all of the things that you all will discover in the future as well. We have about 10 minutes, is there anything specific that you'd like that we haven't kind of touched on? I know that you could talk about this for hours, and even things that I hope that we get to talk about in the future is questions about, here we are at the Historic Arkansas Museum, and as contemporary makers, what is the value of learning these historical methods and learning from material culture, learning from objects in the collection. This is, what you all are doing is what we are here for. We're preserving it so that you can use this information and, you know, let it blossom and have it continue and make it relevant. And that is something that I hope that we can speak about at more length in the future, but,
Okay, good question, and I could say so much. So much.
But again, back to like, you know, if that's another conversation, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to emphasize?
Just on that note, us, you know, we're constantly, as craftspeople and makers of different things, it doesn't matter what, we're constantly looking ahead, and we're trying to reinvent, or we're trying to be innovative, more innovative, come up with new things. There's a time to look back in history. There's things that have been forgotten that need to be rekindled. And so some of these processes like this that have been forgotten, we don't have anybody to ask. All we do is observe and speculate and imitate to the point that we understand again.
Look at the objects and make based on the objects, what the objects are telling you.
Yeah, so this is just one example. There's so many in every object in collections. It can be textiles, it can be pottery, it can be woodworking, it can be something like you know, rocking chairs or complicated joinery. The metallurgy, and not just metallurgy, but the assemblage of this style handle and any other style handle. By looking back in time and observing these things, we learn something from the old masters that we can't learn from the new guys.
Yeah.
From the modern side of things, because the big difference between what we do today in a modern setting, in a modern shop, the big difference between what we do today and what James Black did and people like him did back in the day, we're using totally different thinking. We're using modern tools. It all runs through a shop.
The machine thinking.
We're using a precision. We got this tool and this equipment. We're going to go here from this one to this one to this one, and we're letting automation or jigs and flattening devices and tools and grinders and things help us to do really fine work. Precision. So he didn't have that. He had a vise, a forge, an anvil, and a bunch of hand tools, and he had his mind. So his way of thinking is what enabled him to come up with this process. He started with a steel blade. He made the blank, you know, whereas today, some people buy blanks, and they put scales on it, and they handle it, and it's called a knife, and it is. But Black had to make that blade. Then he had to know something about silver and soldering. He had to know how to file, and filing back then was a different craft than what today. The file might be laying in the bottom of the toolbox and rusted and everything. We still pick it up. We still call it a file, and we still say we're filing. But back in the day, files were a very, very important tool. It was cared for carefully and cherished, because it was how you got your work done, good work done. So he was more of a part of the process than we would be today. So yeah, we can draw and we can use all these tools and equipment, but we have to elevate our skills to be more of an integral part of the process of making these things. It's different, and most people today, when they see a knife that's forged and that's so much work, so much intricacy, and so many textures that are alternating throughout the piece. And this is all consciously done. This is all took a lot of effort, forethought. We learned that kind of thinking from him. Modern people learn that kind of thinking from that kind of situation, that kind of setting.
Yeah.
We go back in history 200 years and we learn that kind of thinking. And when you can change the way you think, you can be more creative. biggest things that I would like to point out and share.
Well said, Lynn.
Thanks. Well, I see Jimmy shaking his head, and I know we've discussed this many times, but that's reinforced, right, Jimmy? A few words. But we talk about it a lot.
You said before, you know, the concept of taking creative risks and, you know, as opposed to leaning on the precision tools, you know, that is kind of a great, kind of what you were talking about, the machine thinking, how can I make this perfect, versus the hand thinking, how can I make this beautiful, how can I make this feel, you know, the way that we feel through creating something is a completely different mindset, and it's exactly what you said, it's something that we can't learn from this time.
From this time period today, no, we can't usually pick that kind of a feeling and that kind of, that kind of thinking. It's only until you go back and you make those things, we understand. And there are crafts, and there are people in this room that do understand it, I know, and it's not people that I mentioned. I know that in some way other folks in this room understand it because they've felt it, they've seen it. It's not anything weird. It's a fact.
It's something that's available to everyone, right? Innately.
Yeah, that's right. It's in us, and once we go back and we see that, hey, this opens up part of me and part of my thinking that I've never been able to use. I never was really aware that that's a new way of looking at things. So looking back at these old masters, seeing how they think, getting in their mind just a little bit, it helps us to think like them, but the net result is we're more creative, and that's kind of the whole point is.
Well, we have about 5 minutes, and so if there's anything, if you would like to open up for questions or invite your